To our topic of the day, Histories of Democracy, Part 2, Global Perspectives, Revolutions, and Empire. Part 1, 2 weeks ago, asked the question, whose democracy? And explored a conversation about the aspirations to and shortcomings of democracy that was anchored in a US-American context. Today, our discussion will push farther, both geographically and conceptually, the boundaries of that preliminary conversation. As a way of introduction to our conversation today, let me just offer 2 anniversary moments. As many of you know, yesterday marked the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. US involvement in that war began with American President Woodrow Wilson's address to Congress on the 2nd of April, 1917, in which he called for a declaration of war. In that speech, he asserted, "The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them." So in this context, imagining democracy as something tied to rights and liberties, freedom of nations, something that could be aspired to and achieved at the end of this war. This past week also marked the 100th anniversary of democracy in Germany. The first German republic was declared on November 9th, 1918. So in some ways, one might assume a fruit of this war to make the world safe for democracy. The fact that this declaration occurred twice on the same day suggests how it was already at the very moment a contested undertaking. But the anniversary was and has been much more complicated because the November 9th has become a rather fraught day in German history looking back at the 20th century. 1923, on the occasion of the anniversary of the founding of the first German Republic, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi supporters tried to overthrow the new republic. So the Beer Hall Putsch, on the occasion of this anniversary, made clear the extent to which this democracy, this new republic, was still being contested, was still being challenged. 15 years later, November 9th, 1938, was the night of the pogrom against Germany's Jewish population, evidencing the extent to which the German experiment in democracy, this first republic, was manifesting what we might call one of its darker possibilities. In 1989, November 9th was an occasion of celebration, the fall of the Berlin Wall that seemed to usher in a new period of democracy and optimism for Europe, both East and West. And this year, as the German Chancellor was looking back and as German newspapers were celebrating and live tweeting the events of that initial revolutionary moment in November 1918, they were also looking back at and recalling this period of violence, the genocidal programs that emerged out of the Nazi regime, and the ambiguous legacy of even the celebratory moment of 1989. So rather than thinking about this democracy as something that was readily available to take off the shelf and be inserted or deployed in these different contexts, the experience of this 100 years in a German context helps to reiterate the ways in which democracy was an evolving process, contested, challenged, and not necessarily resulting in an obviously positive outcome. So what we want to do today is to try to think about the ways in which this democracy, this vision of democracy, this imagining of democracy, was not something that was just dispatched from the United States or made available to those around the world by American presidents, but also to think about the ways in which democracy was something that was imagined and battled over and contested in different spots and different locations around the world. So I want to begin our conversation by turning to Julia Gaffield and to ask her a little bit to talk about that 18th century revolutionary moment that often gets left out of our introductory history surveys, that tend to think about revolution and democracy as 1776 in the United States, or what was becoming the United States, or maybe, if we're lucky, 1789 in France. But maybe you can start off by talking us through what about this other revolutionary moment in this island in the Caribbean, and what can that tell us about what democracy might look like, or how we should reconsider what we think we know about that time and place?
Great, and I'd like to say first, thanks for having me. Thank you for being here. And it has given me a kind of great opportunity to think about my research in a new way. Because my research is on the early independent state in Haiti. They declared independence in 1804, and the typical characterization of the governments that followed, dictatorships, authoritarianism, those are the words that get thrown around. And I, in kind of thinking about what we can learn about democracy from this moment, it pushed me to kind of explore different aspects of the Haitian state, and to think about the kind of innovations at the state level, but then at the local level, that often are forgotten, because a lot of histories of the Haitian Revolution end with the Declaration of Independence, January 1st, 1804, it's over, and then we kind of move on to other places in the world, or we can kind of skip to the American occupation of Haiti in the 20th century. And so there's a lot of really great work being done on the 19th century in the United States. Now it's kind of been done in Haiti, but this is becoming more part of our narrative of the country's history. And so what strikes me, there's this kind of division of the state and the nation. And this is, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot is kind of famous for Silence in the Past, but he's got another great book called State Against Nation. And this is a dynamic that stems from very different definitions of freedom in this age of revolution. And it's a conflict that I think is characterized, Melissa has a great sentence in the introduction of your book, that the kind of essential compromise of democracy is the needs of the whole versus the needs of the individual. And this is a really kind of great way to describe what's happening at this moment. And the needs of the state are kind of protection, right? There's a militarization of the country. And to accomplish that militarization, there's a need for an export-oriented economy to trade in war material. And so there's an emphasis on freedom as defined as the legal abolition of slavery. And to protect that, there's a kind of restriction on the other definition of freedom, which most of the people are fighting for, which is control over one's time and access to land. And so there's a key conflict based on the definition of freedom. But I think there's important things to learn about democracy from both of those definitions. And what's really, I think, relevant about the initiatives of the state, and this kind of continues over various governments, has to do with the kind of conception of the border of the country. There's a very strong protection of the border, and that's particularly emphasized in a restriction on white land ownership, and the idea that that was kind of far too close to colonialism, and so we're going to protect the border in that sense, protect the geography of the country, that the land was going to be owned by Haitians. But then there's a porousness to the border that encourages migration from kind of dispossessed people in the Americas. And so there's a repeated call for people of African descent and natives to come join the country and to enjoy the freedom that Haitians have. And so I think that's a really interesting conception of the borders of the nation and the intentions of the state.
Can I just jump in there for a second? Because this idea of thinking about the freedom of the nation, I think, is really important. And I wonder if just maybe you can help unpack for people a little bit this double nature of freedom that emerges in Haiti. On the one hand, thinking about Haiti as this place that was a French imperial possession, right? Was a source of so much of French wealth before a slave revolution. And so to think about this on the one hand as this island in the Caribbean that was a source of the wealth on which the French Empire depended, but that also depended upon slave labor, and that this revolution that is now ushering in the second independent state in the Western Hemisphere is both about breaking away from French Empire, but also about imagining this completely new way of conceptualizing freedom that is without slavery. So how does that play out, and what sort of tensions does that provoke, not just within this new place, Haiti, but also within the Atlantic world more generally that you talk about in your work?
I mean, it's very much an abolitionist state, right? That is the kind of driving force of independence, is the preservation of abolition. Had abolition not been threatened by a reinvasion or an invasion by Napoleon's forces, right? Independence, kind of officially as a nation state, it might not have gone in that direction. And so the core of Haitian independence is abolitionism. And I think that Haiti doesn't always get included in the same way as kind of other abolitionist histories, but it is an abolitionist state. But the conflict comes from abolition doesn't necessarily mean freedom in the same way that the population who had been enslaved kind of imagined their kind of what freedom would look like. And so there's a really interesting process in this state against nation where there's a system that develops, and it's called the la cour system. It comes from the French la cour, or courtyard. And there's a kind of communal ownership of land that is usually kind of based amongst extended family members. And the state doesn't necessarily have the power to infiltrate the rural areas in the way that it wants to. And so there's an opposition to the state's intended maintenance of the plantation economy by these rural communities that kind of say, no, this is not, your version of freedom is not our version of freedom. And so they kind of institute these social systems that are also kind of economic systems, and they're connected through a local network of markets. And of course, this version of freedom is what really terrifies all of the colonies that are around Haiti, right? Because then it destroys all of their wealth as well. And so that a revolution that destroys the plantation economy has a kind of greater impact than a revolution that maintains the plantation economy and therefore kind of protects that system just without enslavement. And so I think that this much more radical egalitarian tendencies, not completely egalitarian, that is the kind of very threatening version of freedom that has the potential to disrupt the entire economy of the Caribbean, and more broadly, obviously.
So I think this idea of freedom as something that's both liberating us, also potentially threatening, offers a really nice segue to some of Melissa's work in terms of thinking about this different breakup of empire. So if we think about after the First World War and the breakup of empires and newly independent, freed nation states and newly freed individuals as a moment of great opportunity and great possibility, but also great anxiety. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that and set the stage for us in terms of thinking about a different moment of imagining a new kind of freedom and the potential pitfalls that go along with that.
Yeah, so Paul is alluding to actually my earlier work, which is about interwar Czechoslovakia, which I know sounds very esoteric. But I think it actually, the history of Czechoslovak democracy has a lot to say, especially to Americans. So if you've ever heard anything about Czechoslovakia in the first part of the 20th century, it's probably that it was the great democratic exception in Central Europe, or Europe as a whole, because it had a democracy that worked for several decades, when democracies all around it were falling victim to fascism. And my work, and the work of quite a few historians, I think, says that Czechoslovakia both was and was not exceptional. So how was Czechoslovakia exceptional? It was exceptional in that Czechs in particular saw democracy as part of their national identity, in the same way that Americans, I think, see democracy as part of their national identity, or that the French see republicanism, or I would think in Haiti as well, right, as an essential part of their national makeup. And so for Czechs or Czechoslovaks, which is actually a made-up term, and we can talk about that if you want. So I'm not going to be talking about Slovaks very much. If there's anyone in the audience who's Slovak, we can talk about that more. Just to make it not be quite so complicated. But so for Czechs, democracy very much meant modernity. It meant the antithesis of the Habsburg monarchy, right? So it meant progress, it meant moving forward. And because democracy was seen as so integral to the idea of Czechness itself, it was something that Czechs really wanted to defend and wanted to make work. At the same time, Czechoslovakia is not exceptional because it faces many of the or all of the problems that the other countries of Europe face in the 1920s and 1930s, particularly the question of how to deal with minority populations of different kinds and how to basically integrate difference into the nation. So one of the key elements of democracy is, in fact, the idea of individual rights and freedoms. But the question is how to balance that with the needs of the nation. And many people think that what killed democracy in Czechoslovakia was invasion by Nazi Germany. But that's actually not true. So after the Munich Agreement in 1938, the government in Czechoslovakia fell, and a group from the right of the political spectrum came to power, and they created something that they called authoritarian democracy, or you could translate it as authoritative democracy. And I think the reason they came up with this is they wanted to find something that they thought would be compatible with their German neighbors, but they also felt so strongly invested in democracy that they couldn't jettison it entirely. And so with authoritarian democracy, you could do things like limit the number of political parties in the country. You could ban some political parties altogether. You could censor the press. You could promulgate anti-Semitic legislation. You could fire married women from their jobs. You could do so many things, including governing by decree instead of by parliament, that we might, in the end, argue that authoritarian democracy was democracy, in fact, only in name. So my own research concentrated on the idea of women's rights and gender equality in Czechoslovakia. And here also, Czechoslovakia both is, I think, and is not exceptional. So one of the ways in which many Czechs defined democracy in 1918 was that democracy had to include women's equality. And they said this because they thought that making women equal was one element of becoming a modern and progressive nation. This was part of, again, how they would move away from the Habsburg legacy. And so there was great support in Czechoslovakia, for example, for women's suffrage. Women in many countries around the globe gained the right to vote after the First World War. But in Czechoslovakia, there was an unusual enthusiasm for this. So, for example, in the United States, about a quarter of the representatives in the House of Representatives vote against the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. In Czechoslovakia, when the parliament debates women getting the right to vote, no one votes against it at all. So there was a certain amount of support for making women into equal citizens. And in fact, even the Czechoslovak Constitution has a paragraph in it that says that the law should not recognize so-called privileges of sex. But what was not exceptional about Czechoslovakia was that Czechs thought that even if the Constitution implied that the law shouldn't allow gender discrimination, they thought that really it was okay if only men were the legal heads of their households, that men should be able to say whether or not their wives had jobs, that it was fine to fire women from their jobs when they got married, to give their jobs to men, that women who married foreign nationals should immediately lose their Czechoslovak citizenship, and so on. And so I think through this, we see what Paul was getting at, which is that there were two sort of competing definitions of democracy at work here. One based around individuals and the need to protect individual rights, and the second based around collectivities, like the family and the nation, and that says that protecting those institutions is actually more important than protecting individual rights.
Can I just ask one question that I think might be useful in terms of thinking about this, in terms of which of these different categories assumes precedent? And I think this is also particularly relevant at this moment in terms of the terminology that we use to think about how do we organize political belonging. And maybe just ask you a little bit about the place of the nation, right? And even in terms of, if we think about Julia's comments, thinking about nations and nation states and how those fit together. So is there something particular about the nation or the idea of the nation that presents particular challenges for Czechoslovak democracy and for women in Czechoslovak democracy or other groups within Czechoslovak democracy trying to imagine where they fit?
Well, I think the issue here, right, is when it seems like the freedom of the individual might threaten the reproduction and the security of the nation. So it's fine to give women the right to vote, but not to allow them so many rights that it might, in fact, upset the established order in society, right, where women had domain primarily over the family and childcare and this kind of thing. And you know, I think we see this to a certain extent even today, right? We still debate this issue over whether or not the state is really supposed to protect individuals versus the needs of collectivities.
So in terms of thinking about the stories of the individuals and where they fit within the collective, maybe a kind of segue a little bit to Hiba here in terms of thinking about these different ways of imagining who has a place in the political process. In terms of thinking about national language, certainly the nation or national identity becomes a dominant language that operates in the interwar period. And we see now in some ways returning in terms of thinking whether we're talking about Eastern and Central Europe or even with regard to the United States. I wonder a little bit about the areas that you work on and in terms of thinking about the terminology that is used to define who is able to articulate versions of political belonging or political aspirations or political power. What are the implications of including some people or writing other people out of those stories? And maybe in particular to follow up on Melissa's comments, to think about women in these battles for power in the parts of the world that you're looking at, whether kind of Egypt or the Middle East more generally?
So when, excuse me, so when trying to think about questions of gender and citizenship, I think the problem with gender and citizenship has to be, I think, contextualized within a broader problem of citizenship more broadly in the Middle East. And so maybe giving a little bit of background on the Middle East might help to contextualize the problematic of citizenship and citizenship making. So we think of the Middle East as kind of this objective geographic entity, when in fact it's not. You know, the Middle East, it was made, and it was made and remade. And in fact, it was made and remade by a number of sort of external forces. Here I'm thinking more global developments, in conjunction with internal dynamics. And so when we think about three in particular, which really do complicate this question of citizenship and belonging, the first, of course, is the early 20th century imperialism and the question of how Great Britain and France, we're talking about World War I and its anniversary, the fruits of democracy in Europe, it did not produce those fruits in other parts of the world, right? It produced, in fact, the opposite. And so when thinking about imperialism and imperialist legacies, in terms of complicating questions of borders, complicating questions of national identity, that is a legacy that continues that we still see going on today. So in thinking about how literally Great Britain and France carving up the Ottoman Empire and again, literally mapping, in fact, the Middle East is a central question in terms of thinking about, again, it would leave a legacy that will impact citizenship making. The second sort of global event would be the Cold War, and I think we all have something to say about that particular period. For the Middle East, the Cold War is, it produces this effect of essentially entrenching authoritarianism and undermining democracy, if anything, right? So when we think about the interwar period in the Middle East, there's actually a number of movements towards democratization. And in fact, in my classes, I call this the crisis of constitution. There's a constitutional crisis during the interwar period. As you have the British and French remaining in these areas, you have nationalists that are vying for power, and you have a particular head of state, and they're all, it's a very complicated period that many historians do not like to cover because of its complexity and its messiness, but that's in fact where you find the most interesting moments of attempts at democratization. And yet, if you think about Constitution, what the Constitution's purpose is, it is to protect the people from government. And yet what emerges in the Middle East is, particularly with the coming of the Cold War, the entrenching of these authoritarian regimes, the institutionalization of secularism as the sort of nationalist ideology of the day, what ultimately it ends up doing is it creates a constitution that protects the state against the people. And so there's an interesting crisis that happens that's resolved with authoritarianism, and we don't see democracy flourish. And then the last sort of global event that again is impacting citizenship making is, of course, the rise of the U.S. as the sole superpower in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so when you think about how the United States, given its interest in oil, given its interest in Israel, given its interest in the Middle East as a geostrategic location, given its interest in arms sales, right? All of these things have created complications for the region in ways that we still see play out today. So, for example, when we think about how Middle Eastern regimes are either installed, i.e. the 1953 coup in Iran, or how authoritarian regimes are supported, i.e. if we think about Egypt as being the second recipient of aid after Israel, right? These are regimes that are not exactly allowing for democracies in the flourishing of democracies in their context. But most, I think importantly, in thinking about the Islamist component. So Islamism is a political ideology that emerges in the 1970s. We know it best because the Islamist regime that is most successful in moving from its oppositional position to establishing itself is Iran. But when you look at it in the Middle East more broadly, it is in fact a movement that they advocate for essentially a religious state, an Islamic state. They are the most highly mobilized, most highly effectively, so organized and mobilized opposition to authoritarian regimes in the region. And for this reason, scholars like John Esposito, John Ball at Georgetown, interestingly enough and paradoxically, ask us to think about whether we can think of Islamists as democracy makers, right? Because on the one hand, yes, they're advocating for an Islamic state, but their function as society is to oppose authoritarianism and try to open the political system. And if that, and thereby create this paradox, but also challenge for the United States, because of course it's not in our interest to see Islamists come to power after having, of course, having come to power and creating problematic, not just with the United States, but with Israel. So this question of, and then add the war on terror, right? The war on terror has only given a carte blanche to Middle Eastern states to continue its repressive regimes against Islamists. And so when we think about the ways in which these global developments are literally undermining democratic processes, including the very recent, you couldn't get more democratic than the Arab Spring in 2011. And what's interesting is that the United States is not supporting those folks in the streets, right? When we think about Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, he's worse than Mubarak. People are calling the regimes that are coming to power after having toppled despots, they're calling those the new authoritarianism of the Middle East, because not only they were able to get to power, but also because of the U.S. support that is keeping them there. So this question of global sort of dynamics, internal dynamics, external dynamics coming together has really complicated this question of citizenship making, so that when you add women to the mix, it's even more complicated, because the state wants to not only regulate women's bodies and labor in ways that are productive for the state, and that again is coming back to this question of citizenship benefiting the state rather than a protection for the people against the state. And so I think I'll stop there. I'm sure there might be other comments.
Well, I have to say, I feel like every time anybody says something that I feel like I said, well, we should give everybody else on the panel a chance to respond to these precise moments. I feel like the idea of these moments of the potential for democratic flourishing in the messy aftermath of the breakup of empires or the end of the First World War seem to be offering this fruitful and productive opportunity for democracy, and yet that doesn't manifest itself in the Middle East. And I think the extent to which there's this messy moment in the connection with the Haitian Revolution that seems to offer opportunities, but also ties into questions of economic competition and wars and battles for empire. But maybe this is, before we give everybody else a chance to jump in, at least let me give Maya a chance to speak for a few minutes here. But precisely about this moment, after 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, after 1991 with the breakup of the Soviet Union, it seems to be this moment of incredible optimistic possibility. Precisely this opportunity for the flourishing of democracy, and as Francis Fukuyama famously said, right, kind of as the end of history, now we're just kind of competing for markets, kind of the big ideological struggles are over. And yet that moment of optimism, of possibility, seems to have waned. And I wonder if you couldn't maybe help, by looking in at these post-Soviet areas, help us to think through this multi-layered messiness that is going on there, and perhaps help us to think through who was in the mix and what they were striving for, and why these happy outcomes that everybody seems to be anticipating, whether it's in interwar Czechoslovakia or in the aftermath of the First World War, don't quite seem to manifest.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. I think listening to everyone here, I'm reminded of just how important geography is and how important geopolitics is, right? So I think the post-Soviet story is so much of the story of how geopolitics shaped that post-Cold War era region. So if I have to sort of give you a quick tour of what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, you really were left with almost like 3 categories of countries. This is vast land, so the Eurasian heartland, to borrow Mackinder's term. So really, if you look from west to the east, that's just how it went. West to the east, democracy to authoritarianism. That's what we were left with by the end of the 90s, early 2000s. So there's a group of the countries, Central and Eastern European countries, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Slovakia included, they successfully sort of graduate, right? There are these terms set forth from the EU and the transatlantic organizations, and they graduate into democracy, they graduate into EU membership. But what does that mean? It sets a standard for the rest of the countries, well, at least sort of in the Black Sea area, that this is the gold standard. You graduate, you become a democracy when you join NATO and when you join the EU. But on the opposite side of that spectrum, particularly in the late 90s with Putin's arrival at the helm of this re-established Russia, if you will, after the lull of the early and mid-90s, you have exactly the opposite. You have countries, particularly again Central Asia, Belarus, Russia, who failed to democratize but borrowed some forms of democracy, some parts of the prescriptions that they had received from the West. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what's left in between are these countries that people have struggled to come up with terms for, who are not quite democracies, not quite authoritarian regimes. Oftentimes you'll hear them referred to as hybrid regimes, and that's Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, to a degree Armenia, sometimes Azerbaijan, although not anymore. So really you have this gradients in that region, west to east, democracy to authoritarianism. So then once Russia rises under Putin, really that region is characterized by this very bipolar situation. You're either a democracy, meaning you're with the EU and NATO, or you're with Russia or under very heavy Russian influence. So I think what's really interesting there is that even before Fukuyama said that it was the end of history, in most of these countries, so that land that's left in between Russia and the European Union, their history had ended long time ago. If you want to think about them buying into the idea of democracy, buying into the idea of wanting universal freedoms. It started well before the Soviet Union, so the end of World War I had actually brought a whole array of democratic republics. Georgia was one of them. Actually, the entire Caucasus region ended up becoming this this group of democratic republics that lived just for a couple of years, and again they were forcefully annexed by the USSR. So. Unfortunately, so much of their contemporary history is characterized by this tug of war between Russia and the West, and especially now in the contemporary context.
So I want to pick up. Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
So I just wanted to make a comment based upon this idea of sort of graduating to democracy. And because I don't actually think that you do, and I'm not the only one. So I brought a quote, which is from Václav Havel, who was a dissident under communism in Czechoslovakia, and then after 1989 became the first president of a post-communist Czechoslovakia and then Czech Republic. And Havel came to the United States in 1990 and gave an address to the US Congress. And in that, he said, as long as people are people, democracy in the full sense of the word will always be no more than an ideal. one may approach it as one would a horizon, in ways that may be better or worse, but it can never be fully attained. In this sense, you too are merely approaching democracy. And I've always really loved that because I think that it makes sense to think of democracy as, in fact, a process, right? And because I think democracy always pushes us to ever new debates, right? So, we can think in the United States, we keep having expanding definitions of what does it mean to have individual freedom, for example, right? What are the requirements of democracy? We actually never agree. Our definitions keep changing, and I think that it's very useful to maybe recall that that's part of the nature of democracy. So in a sense, we're never going to have that settled.
I agree absolutely. Actually, the problem with graduation to democracy was this creation of a lot of cynicism. Right? You've joined the EU, you've graduated into democracy, and now you face a whole bunch of new issues, and so much of that, I think, explains a lot of the current regression within the European Union, particularly in Hungary and Poland. So it is such an interesting dynamic that for those who are left outside the EU, I always say this is the best illustration how one man's trash can be another man's treasure. So there is still this aspirational character to EU membership, NATO membership, if you're outside of it. Because you still think about Poland who graduated into democracy. If you're Ukraine, all you really would like to do is be a part of NATO and the EU because it guarantees certain securities that Poland enjoys, right? But on the other hand, what's on the other side of that how green the grass is on the other side, that's a completely separate discussion. So this is why the region is so complex that, if you look at it from east to the west, the picture is completely different. Whereas if you're in the west and you look eastward, it's a completely different situation. So, unfortunately, for these countries, when they look at the alternative, it's Russia.
So I wonder if this might be an interesting place to interject you back into the conversation, Julia, in terms of thinking about the kind of the multi-layered elements that go into trying to think about participating and in shaping both states and both imagining what democracy might be. And in terms of what sorts of limits are put on those kinds of possibilities, whether it's in terms of economics, whether it's in terms of geopolitical situation, whether it's in terms of alliances, whether it's in terms of ideology. So recognizing we're kind of jumping back and forth from time and geography, and as Maya suggests, like geography matters, but how does looking at 19th century Haiti help us to think about the ways in which these multiple factors are shaping what kind of limits or possibilities are there for democracy?
Yeah, this language of graduating, not the same language in the 19th century, I guess it would be maybe the language of civilization and the kind of international conversations about a very racialized version of who can become become a civilized nation, and that democracy is only appropriate for what eventually becomes kind of certain races, and so there are limits placed on from the outside as to which there's a lot of kind of internal, external, and support of different governments, but there's the portrayal, both internationally and from the elite in Haiti, of the preparedness of the population to participate in politics, and that kind of excluding them is justified based on a very racialized version of civilization. And so the language and the kind of restrictions and the power hierarchies as to who has the authority to kind of welcome somebody into the community of democracies. There are just so many parallels, and I think this probably goes with all of our work, that are there in the early to mid 19th century in Haiti.
Yeah, but do you want to weigh in on that as well in terms of thinking about who is authorized to sort of claim status as a democrat or be a participant in democracy?
So I think I'll make two comments to that. I think the first is this question of, I mean, it goes back to this question of Islamism and whether we might be able to consider it or conceive of it as something positive as opposed to evil and threatening, especially when we consider that the vast majority of Islamists work within the political system, or they're working in exile but still within the political system, right? We tend to think of Islam, we collapse the word Islamism with terrorists now, right? So this idea of thinking about Islamism as non-threatening, but then also accepting the fact that if the vast majority of people in parts, or a majority, or maybe not a majority, but a significant number of people in the region would like to have, let's just say hypothetically, would like to have, I know what the optics look like when I say this comment, would like to have an Islamic state, right? Let's just consider that. And they vote that in. What might that look like? In other words, notwithstanding the U.S. interferences that undermine these sorts of efforts, but the question becomes, how are different parts of the world conceiving themselves as modern citizens in a way that looks very different than other parts of the world? And given the kind of global context, geopolitical context we live in, and given particular interests, that complicates the question of whether these Islamists will be allowed to work within the system. But working outside of it also creates problems, right? So they're not just oppositional forces, but some of them are radicalizing in the ways that we're watching unfold. And if they're not allowed a space in the political system, and they're not allowed a voice in the political system, what does that mean for not only those countries in the region, but also for the rest of the world if in fact, particularly the United States, when in fact some of these folks understand the U.S. support of these Middle Eastern secularist regimes as being part of the problem, and hence making the U.S. a target. And so it's a much more complicated web of alignments and non-alignments, or alignments that are making the question of conceiving of citizenship very fraught. It's a very fraught process. I can't recall my second point, but I'm sure most of my students out there will know me very well. They say, yes, that happens all the time. It'll come back.
Can I just ask about this idea of kind of imagining Islamists as participants in democracy? And I wonder if that might be useful just in terms of thinking about how we can kind of disconnect the different pairings that we assume go together. So during the Cold War, the idea of communism versus democracy, kind of freedom versus authoritarianism, or as Maya was suggesting, this idea of, well, it's the West versus the East, it's either kind of democracy or Russia, and this idea that there's this inherent sense of democracy as an explicit good that is to be aspired to. And I was wondering a little bit about sort of the bad outcomes of these various messy periods that we've been talking about, or the ambiguous outcomes of these various messy periods. Is this a problem that kind of the wrong people have been doing democracy? Or is there something about democracy itself that it is open to not just these positive outcomes, but that there's kind of a dark underside to democracy as well? And how does that play out? Or maybe that's something we can speculate a little about in these different moments that you're looking at.
Well, first, just a comment that's a little bit aside from your question, but it's something that I've been thinking about, which is that I think it's at our peril that we assume that societies that are less democratic than we are somehow bad, and that they're obviously different from us. And I'm thinking about a column I read in the New York Times a few days ago by one of their columnists who went to Budapest, and which has become a little bit more authoritarian lately, and he was very surprised that Budapest seemed so Western and charming and pleasant, as if it wouldn't be. So I think that it's a little bit at our peril that we assume that we can tell what a good or democratic society is from the outside, right, as opposed to from the inside, because we might go there and find that we're surprised at what we see and how much similar the people are to us. But to get more to your question about democracy's dark sides, or the problems there, I think, and I'll maybe give you one more quote that I had written down, and this is from a woman who was a senator in Czechoslovakia in the 1920s and 1930s, and also the leader of its feminist movement. And in 1938, as it looked like the state was facing enormous challenges, she said in the Senate, "Democracy is not easy. Democracy demands the re-education of all of us. It demands internal discipline so that we, individuals in a family, in a society, in a political party, in a nation or a state, can restrain ourselves from that which irritates or upsets others, so that as a society, we can create the conditions for calm, genial understanding." So in a sense that in democracy, we have to be able to somehow master our emotions and deal calmly with other people who might think differently from us to create some kind of consensus. And I think that's certainly an ideal, but actually democracy is very bad at allowing for emotions. Democracy actually wants us to be always calm and rational. And when we are calm and rational, we can do democracy much better. But when we are carried away by our passions, that's when, right, we don't want to make compromises, and when we're willing maybe to jettison the rules because they don't seem so important. So I think maybe that's one of the issues on the other side of democracy that we maybe should deal with.
I've in kind of response to your prompt for that question, in thinking about the Haitian case and going back to what I was talking about, these kind of the opposition to the state in communal land holding, I've been thinking about the kind of individualism that is championed in democracies, and I think that has the potential to be very destructive, and certainly the kind of extended family networks and kind of local socioeconomic systems were seen as very threatening to the state, and therefore this kind of emphasis on individualism would have been a tool to kind of break up those networks and support systems in a lot of ways. And so I see the kind of, the emphasis on individualism as a potential dark side.
I just want to add something quick to that. So you were talking about the dark sides of democracy. I'm going to paraphrase something Vladimir Putin said. He said, just because one group of people believe that one way of development is the best way to run your country doesn't mean that everyone else has to buy into it. What did he mean? So he was commenting about Western liberal democracy and democracy in Russia. All the post-Soviet countries, when the Soviet Union fell apart, they had wrote up constitutions, and every one of those constitutions says that the country is a democracy. Belarus is a democracy, but I mean in practice it's not, right? So I think in the case of the countries that I watch, the dark side of democracy is that it's a menu. It's a menu of suggestions, and then someone like Putin, I keep saying his name, but maybe other authoritarian leaders, can pick and choose from this menu to create what they call a managed democracy, right? So maybe I want elections, but maybe I don't want them to be free and fair, or maybe I will let them be free and fair, but I will fix the process in advance, so I will handpick who will run, things like that. So it's really how you define democracy matters, but then what each government chooses to do with those menu items, if you will, is a different story. So for Eastern Europe, I think it comes with a lot of cynicism, again, because of this whole graduation idea. The prescription of reforms that they were supposed to put in place, a lot of these countries placed them just on the surface, didn't fully buy into these reforms. So what you ended up in the end was just meeting enough of the check marks to receive the aid, to receive membership, to receive free trade, whatever it may be, but how much those standards took a hold is a different story. So again, even in the most extreme cases of authoritarianism, you will hear the leaders say, we are a democracy. We have bought into democracy, and moreover, for example, most Russians think they live in a democracy. So if you live in Russia right now and you think that's democracy, that is a very different experience of democracy from what we have now. So this pseudo-democracy is this, I don't even know if it's a side of democracy, because it's not democracy, right? It's this fake name of it that is being used in vain.
Can I just make a brief comment to that, which is that this isn't something that I've really researched, but I certainly can say in the case of the former Czechoslovakia that in 1989, people definitely wanted democracy, but they also wanted to keep socialism, right? And they wanted to be able to merge those two things together. But then what they found out was the democracy that they were offered was also capitalist. And in order to have democracy, they had to have capitalism. And so some of that cynicism, I think, comes from that marriage as well, which then they weren't able to effectively redefine, right? So if that's another possible dark side of democracy, it's that we tend to tie it to certain kinds of economic systems, which don't necessarily fulfill everyone's needs.
Actually, I was just going to say, in the Middle East, you cannot understand sort of the Arab uprising or movements for democracy without understanding the demographics and the tremendous demographic growth in the region, which is just, it's spectacular in a very problematic way. But research suggests, though, that many folks who are in favor of democracy also understand it in very economic terms, but for very utilitarian purposes, right? Because the economic system is broke, because the political system is broke. Part of what they are seeing in democracy is not simply just citizenship and constitutions and elections, right? They're seeing opportunities for economic mobility, opportunities for employment, opportunities for greater educational expansion. And so I think this question, given the illiteracy rate, so I think this question about whether it's a bad thing or not, I think also has to do with where you're talking about and how that population understands democracy in ways that are very utilitarian and not simply about political aspirations.
So I have a long list of things that I could keep asking about, but I also want to open up the opportunity for some of you in the audience to pose some questions and engage our panelists here. Could I just ask one follow-up question? And this is to think a little bit about how do arguments about the past shape contemporary engagement with these histories? And so to some extent, this is even just in terms of naming. So the Arab Spring, thinking back to the Prague Spring, or thinking about the protests in Hungary in 1956 that gesture back to the nationalist movements of 1848 and 1849, and to think about the ways in which this memory of Dessalines and kind of these commemorative moments then become staging grounds, particular arguments about the nature of protest or democracy. How is that both the possibility for popular engagement, but how does that also perhaps speak of the ways in which historians can participate in these kinds of conversations, or that historical perspective matters for these ongoing processes of trying to sort out the possibilities of democracy.
I mean, I think there's a very specific kind of set of moments that get remembered and championed, and I think a lot of this points to American exceptionalism, and so right over the last few decades, there's been a kind of explosion in the U.S. of scholarship on the Haitian Revolution, but it had been kind of considered a great failure, and that there was kind of nothing to learn from the Haitian Revolution about democracy, about politics, about freedom, and that it had been kind of read through the kind of next 200 years, and it kind of has it's like Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, kind of became its name, and its entire history gets read through that alleged failure, and kind of all of the failure is put on Haiti itself. And so there's a very, in the age of revolution, it's only very recently that historians and a broader public are kind of undoing that, what Michel Rolfe-Trio called silencing of the successes of the Haitian Revolution, and all of the different features that we can learn from the revolution and its aftermath. And so it's a very kind of specific, very white set of moments that get remembered and championed in kind of the teaching of the history of democracy. And I think, obviously, not exclusively, but that needs to be challenged, because that's a history of democracy that itself is very flawed and very exclusive and very hierarchical.
And I think I would just say that it's the job of historians, unfortunately, to complicate the past, because the tendency of governments is to want to make the past into a simple story that can promote current regimes. And so you were mentioning the ways in which, for example, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 might be remembered, or the Prague Spring of 1968. And certainly the current regime in Hungary, to the extent that it wants to remember 1956 at all, wants to see it only as something that is somehow anti-communist, right, and anti-Soviet, and does not want to remember the origins of 1956, which are actually inside the Communist Party. So that the Orban regime right now is trying to remove a memorial of the communist leader Imre Nagy right off of the square next to the parliament, because it doesn't fit the ways in which they would like to remember this particular moment of protest in the past, right? In the same way that in having the Arab Spring sort of harken back to the Prague Spring did not begin as something that was about creating a democratic regime, but a way of changing socialism to make it more livable. But that's not the way in which we necessarily want to remember it in the West. Instead, we really just want to remember the Soviet tanks coming into Czechoslovakia.
Additional questions out there that...
I think when a lot of us hear the term nationalism, we immediately think of post-World War I Europe. And I'm wondering if nationalism in the purest sense can coexist with democracy, or eventually will one overtake the other?
Nationalism and democracy, mutually exclusive? Or, I mean, the extent to which, I mean, the nation or the nation state has been a thread that has woven in various ways through many of our comments here this evening, less so about nationalism. Is that, how can the term nationalism inform even our thinking about something like the nation state and its relationship to democracy?
The problem with nationalism is that it is inherently exclusive, whereas democracy, at least in its ideal form, should be inclusive. And so the trick is to try and balance those two things. That is a difficult task, right? Which is why you mentioned this after the end of the First World War, and that's one of the reasons that European democracies have such a difficult time of it, right, in this period. That's true in the case I know best of Czechoslovakia, certainly as well, because Czechs and to a certain extent Slovaks want to see themselves as inherently democratic. They would prefer to forget that there are lots of German speakers and Hungarian speakers in the country. And while they are willing to incorporate them to a certain extent, they still want to see the country as a state that is there for the Czechoslovak nation and not the German nation or the Hungarian nation. And for a while, they are able to hold that in balance. And eventually not anymore. But so, sometimes I think it can work and sometimes not, right? But to me, that's the issue.
I just want to quickly add, at least for the countries that I study, when I hear nationalism, I hear civil wars and lack of compromise, and that's specifically for the countries that I'm looking at. Right now, I'm studying what they call frozen conflicts, or these post-Soviet de facto states. So disputed territories that have been suspended in limbo for 30 years. And it's very much a part of the uncompromising nationalism that came about in the independence movements after the Soviet Union fell apart in places like Georgia, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan to a degree. So from the experiences of the places I look at, it's a difficult picture. I agree with you completely. There ought to be some balance, but I'm witnessing the worst cases of it and decades-long lasting terrible results. So
I think going back to the compromise between the needs of the state and the needs of the individual, I think nationalism is a way to kind of promote the needs of the state over the needs of the individual. And where that becomes particularly problematic for democracy, I think, is in terms of competition amongst nations. And so that pressure at the state level to trump the needs of the individual kind of becomes much more extreme. And so the competition among nations and the kind of use of nationalism to support that competition, I think becomes particularly problematic for democracy.
Eva, can I just ask you maybe to weigh in here a little bit? My question is, one term that we haven't really introduced in this conversation about nation or nationalism or kind of states is so much the idea of empire. And in your opening remarks, you were talking about this moment as the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, in terms of thinking about the different ways in which there were possibilities for reimagining the Middle East and the ways in which that got caught up in battles between France and Britain and European empires. But to what extent is nation or nationalism a useful term in terms of trying to decipher that evolution? How does that fit within kind of the democratic possibility or the aspirational political movements that develop in those in in the former Ottoman territories at that time.
So when thinking about especially the interwar period, nation was a very useful political category to think about in terms of thinking about resistance to empire, right? So thinking about the ways in which emerging nations or nationalisms were trying to understand themselves in contradistinction to the imperial rulers in a way that, so thinking about, for example, the opting of secular socialist nationalism as their articulation for, or their political aspiration, in contradistinction to democratic ideals of democracy, given that they had experienced Western democracy and capitalism in a way that was obviously not democratic and was very exploitative. And so it is in fact it's in fact a point of contrast for a lot of these nationalists who are trying to reimagine or imagine what the nation would look like. Europe, in fact, becomes a very important point, or empire becomes a very point of, a very important point of distinction for these reimaginings.
Maybe time for another couple of questions here before we. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brigideri. Thinking specifically, Dr. Brigideri, about your point regarding states' efforts to co-opt social movements. It seems that, at least in the mainstream, there is mainstream conversations about democracy. There is a presupposition about the necessity of the state and state institutions. And yet at the same time, there is a history of radically democratic non-statist communities forming, and running alongside that a rich philosophical tradition that not only rejects the state, but points to the state as the source of oppression, or a source of oppression, and a perpetuator of inequality. So I wonder if, in your opinion, it's advisable or even possible in the contemporary political discourse to decouple the state and democracy, and if so, what you think the consequences of that decoupling would be.
Well, we are witnessing that in the non-state actors that we see in terms of these sort of more radical elements of Islamists, right? Though they don't necessarily, depending on who they are, I don't want to homogenize or generalize, but there's a number of, there's articulations within Islamism that thinks not in terms of nation state, but in terms of caliphate, right? Going back to, not necessarily back to, instead of establishing the exact same caliphate, but the idea of a sort of trans or pan-Islamic empire, for lack of a better term, that does not necessarily run, right? And so these are non-state actors. But again, how are this, and this is why I sort of asked that question earlier about, can we in the United States, in the West, sort of imagine a world in which there are people who don't necessarily accept the democratic ideals that we have established and live by most, well, not now, but generally. There are people who are imagining that process very differently. And then this question of course, the war on terror and the ways in which we are villainizing particular people, and the radicalization process through state violence. These are all factors that, again, come into play in terms of messiness, but there are absolutely those people out there. The question becomes, are they viable, right? Given these global sort of realities that I sort of pointed to. Did that answer your question?
Julia, could you talk a little bit about non-state actors? Because I think one of the things that's so interesting about your work in the 19th century is how the kind of the revolutionary possibilities that get negotiated with regard to Haiti are so much dependent upon merchants and lawyers and all these different traders that are in the midst of this. It's not just a question of kind of politicians and military leaders. Does that also offer a way of imagining a more complicated version of what democratic or revolutionary success looks like?
Yeah. The kind of typical narrative of Haitian independence had been that it was isolated from the world around it until France recognized the country 21 years after they declared independence, which is of course not true. And there were international merchants coming to Haiti to trade legally and illegally, which then kind of gave independence a degree of legitimacy on the international stage. They secured de facto recognition before French recognition. And so these kind of international individuals, many of whom were from the US and the British Empire, the Danish and Dutch empires, kind of went around whatever their respective states might have been saying in some cases, although some of it was legal, and in some ways supported Haitian independence through trade. And that had very serious implications and kind of pushed various governments to recognize, and they were petitioning their own governments to recognize Haiti, to establish diplomatic relations, to facilitate their kind of business endeavors. And so they're kind of participating in the Haitian state and in some ways supporting the Haitian state, but they're not formally engaging in the same way that they might had they established diplomatic relations. So there's this kind of outside of politics network of semi-political actors who often serve as unofficial consuls because they don't actually have consuls. And so there is this community of people, foreigners usually, who are participating in the kind of Haitian state project, but they're not inside the state, they're not citizens, and they're not acting as political or diplomatic envoys or something like that. I don't know if that's getting at what.
Well, I think thinking about the ways in which democracy is about much more than elections and about participation in structures other than just explicit politics, and that perhaps one of the questions about imagining democratization, that it's not just about kind of electoral observers or thinking about that way of measuring democracy, but that there are other processes that are part of that are also important for us to think about.
So the first president of Czechoslovakia, a man named Tomáš Masaryk, was a sort of philosopher, and he wrote many essays about democracy. And one of the things that he said was that a true democrat will not act democratically only in parliament, but in all areas of life. So for him, democracy was not just a form of government, it was a way of being and acting in the world. And I think that's maybe part of what you're getting at, that for Masaryk, the responsibility for maintaining democracy in that sense rested with everyone, and not only elected representatives, because it was the responsibility of all of us to create a truly democratic society.
And perhaps on that aspirational note, we can bring our conversation to conclusion. So.